All right. Hi. As usual, we speak based on the Pasha of the week, based on the Rebbe's Sichos, and based on ourselves. In Pasha's Pinchass, there's an interesting inyan. You know, I'm sure you learned that in Pasha's Pinchass there is a counting of the Yidden. The first time that mentioned counting is in Pasha's Bamidbar, and then in Pasha's Pinchass. And in this counting, the Torah does not only mention the count, it mentions also the mishpachos, the families of the Shvatim, not only the Shvatim. And it also mentions some occurrences, some things that happened during the journey in the Midbar. Because this counting took place at the end of this 40-year journey in the desert. As Rashi says, that this was the time when Moshe was supposed to relinquish control to Yeshua. So when there is a transfer from one leader to the other, there was a counting. So this was at the end of the 40 years. And the Torah mentions during the counting certain things that occurred in the last 40 years. And one of the things that Torah mentions is the episode with Korach. When it mentions Shevet Reuven, so it mentions the names. Eliyav, the son of Reuven, and then there is Nemuah with Dosan Va'aviram. It mentions Dosan Va'aviram, and it mentions all the things associated with Dosan Va'aviram, that they rebelled together with Korach, and then the earth split open and they were swallowed up, them and all that was with them. And then it says a novel thing, that Korach's sons did not die. That's what it says. It's very interesting that the Torah tells us here at the counting, 40 years later, that Korach's sons didn't die. At the time when it happened, the Torah doesn't mention anything. But here it mentions, they didn't die. And another interesting thing, it doesn't say Bnei Korach was not swallowed up by the earth. It says they didn't die. Because in fact, it says earlier that the earth swallowed them up, it says swallowed up everybody. Korach and all of them, and everybody was swallowed up. And here it tells us a no thing. Bnei Korach lo yimesu. Bnei Korach didn't die. So Rashi right away explains, what does it mean, B'nei Korach lo yimesu? So Rashi says that B'nei Korach, they were actually the original instigators. Instigator? What is that? Bastikatim. Okay. They were part of the original builders of the rebellion. B'nei Korach. But then at the end, they hirharu tshuva, and they thought, they had a thought of repentance, a thought of regret. And with this thought of regret, this saved them. And Nizbatzir lohem mokim goveya begehenim, a high place in the Gehenim was prepared for them, and that's where they sat. That's what Rashi says. So the Rebbe, like nobody else, explains all the details in this Rashi. Told on the questions, I'm not going to go into the questions, I just want to get the view that actually they were swallowed up because Rashi says, they were instigated, they were part of the Melchama. And when they did tshuva, they didn't come out and say, wait a second, we do tshuva, we change our minds. Didn't come out. Hirharu tshuva. They only thought in their mind of tshuva. They didn't actually come out and say, right, they didn't make an announcement, we are wrong, we are doing tshuva. They didn't do that. The real tshuva, complete tshuva, is when you correct the evil, the bad that you did. If you got people to fight Moshe, you have to come out and make them apologize to Moshe and make up with Moshe. You have to correct your damage. That's a real tshuva. The Gemara says that what is a real tshuva? When is a person recognized that he is about tshuva, that he is no longer suspect on being able to repeat what he did, and that is if he was tested with the same challenge another time in an exact similar situation. In an exact similar situation. And he, like for instance, the Gemara says, "Allah, they say halacha b'emesim." A shoichet has really a lot of challenges. A shoichet has to be a very big Yiras Shamayim, because he comes up to this behemoth and he shechts. Nobody can tell, because when you shecht, for instance, if your hand stops in the middle and starts up again, it's a whole shaila on the shechit. And if you, instead of shechting normally, if you press it up, press it down, like the behemoth is lying down, you give it a press. That's called, and that also makes a behemoth treif. Nobody can tell. Only the shoichet knows if something happens. And let's say a sheikh, for a second, he gave it a press. It wasn't going, so he gave it a press. The behemoth is in the veil, is treif. He has to come up and say,
Then if the sheikh is having a hard time, what is he supposed to do?
he has to go, you can go as long as you want. You can take for an hour and cut it through. As long as you go normal, but if you give it a press, that makes it treif. And the sheikh had a shiloh. He thought maybe I pressed it. He has to come up and say, it's reif. And there's a loss of hundreds of dollars.
I thought they sell to the guy.
Nowadays, you're right. Nowadays the loss is much less. Nowadays, because they shecht hundreds of cattle in a day, but in olden days, a katzev, a butcher, had one behemoth to shecht. And if the sheikh fouled up, he lost his whole fortune. Excuse me? Yeah, he lost his whole fortune. And the sheikh has to be able to say, this is treif, it's no good. And, he fouled up. So the din is that a butcher, somebody who was caught selling treifa meat, so he is then forbidden to deal with meat altogether. You're not allowed to buy meat from him at all. How can he rehabilitate himself? How can he prove himself that he's no longer capable of misleading people like this? That witnesses come and say, I've seen this person take a very big loss on account of kashrus. And nobody was there. There was a shaila, and he took a big loss because there was a shaila on kashrus. So you know already that he rehabilitated himself. He is now a Yiras Shamayim. Then you can begin to trust him again. And if not, you can't. And he finds, let's say, an avodah, he finds a lost article that has a semen on it. and it's worth a lot of money. And he goes and he makes the announcement, I found it. Then it shows that he is Yerushalayim. That he will not bend a halacha in a Torah for money. Then you can begin to trust. In other words, it has to be a similar thing that counter affects, that proves his repentance. This is one of the reasons that the Torah says that when you do tshuva, you have to be hisavado. You have to actually say it verbally. I've done such and such, and I regret it. On Yom Kippur, in the davening of Yom Kippur is a day of atonement, and we get that we do tshuva. On Yom Kippur, we say al chet. This al chet, twice the olive base. We mention all kinds of different transgressions possible for a person to do. And if somebody knows of something that he is guilty of, that is not mentioned in the al-chet, he should, during that time, add it. He should add it. I want to mention a little story that I once saw, talking about al-chet. In the time of the Rambam, there was a big Rav. And the Rav wrote to the Rambam that he does not say al-chet. Why? Because he knows that he didn't do these sins. So how can I say al-chet? Stand in front of the Meibush, no lie, say something that's not true. So the Rambam writes back to him, and he said, you so-and-so. You know what so-and-so means? You lowlife. Do you know who you're talking to? What kind of great king you are talking to? Do you understand that sin is all relative according to the person? If you're a greater scholar, so your sins have to be more sensitive. And if you would reflect in truth where you stand, you will find that you are over on all the al-chets and then some. That's the okay. So tshuva, real tshuva is a real tshuva. You have to actually correct what you did. Here, the Bnei Korach, they instigated the rebellion in the Jewish community against Moshe Rabbeinu, against Hashem. They brought people to do Torahs that is forbidden, all kinds of different things. Many people died on account of them. They just thought of tshuva. Boom. All of a sudden, they got a high place in Gehenna. And I want to mention further that these Bnei Korach, they actually fell into the ground, as the Pasuk says, and they were saved. They lasted under the ground. They sat under the ground. And the Rebbe explains in the Sikha, why does the Torah mention this over here by this second counting, not at the time when it happened? Why does it mention over there that Bnei Korach did tshuva and they came out? And the answer is because the Bnei Korach did not do tshuva overtly. Overtly means openly. Nobody knew that he did tshuva. Only the Eibishter knew. So therefore, at that time, they had to be swallowed up because nobody knew they did tshuva. Hashem knew that they thought of tshuva and Hashem saved them. Now, at the end of the 40 years, when all the people that were then present are no longer here, because you know that they all died in the desert, Now there was a new generation. These people were not present at the time of the Koirach incident. So now they came out. Now everybody saw that they lived. Before that, nobody knew it. But what I want to focus on is this phenomenon that they just thought of doing tshuva, heard tshuva, and immediately it saved them. And as I started mentioning, that the Bnei Koirach ultimately were very great men. The Bnei Koirach are the authors of a big part of the Tehillim. I'm sure when you say Tehillim, you see Bnei Koirach, Bnei Koirach.
The bench.
Huh?
The bench.
In the benching, it's a benching that Bnei Koirach, but even the Lamnatseach that we say by Tkiya Shefer was composed of Bnei Koirach. Lamnatseach, Bnei Koirach Mizmer. Many Kippur Chtilim were written by Bnei Koirach. And Shmuel Hanovi was also a descendant of the Bnei Koirach. Shmuel Hanovi, it says Shmuel Hanovi was like Moshe and Aaron combined. So we ought to understand, Mizboina, so to speak, think, what does it mean they thought of do tshuva, and the whole thing turned around, even though it wasn't a full-fledged tshuva the way it should be. And the principle in this is very important for us to understand. In a nutshell, in brief, the principle is that, as the Rebbe explains, that even a person sins, the sin only applies, only his thoughts, his lower elements, even his seichel, his emotion and his seichel can participate in the sin. But the soul itself, there's a certain part in the soul that cannot possibly participate in the sin, because that is really one thing with Hashem, and there's no way that part of the soul can participate in sin. So that when a person thinks of doing tshuva, he immediately connects to that part of the soul, and thus the tshuva has that effect. And I want to discuss this phenomenon. When one is doing something wrong, and he is enticed, he's drawn to do something wrong. Even, let's say, as simple, he gets angry. He gets angry, or he fights, or a more severe thing, he has an isoyin of some kind. It's almost inevitable. You know what inevitable means? It's impossible otherwise. It cannot be otherwise. That someplace in his mind, at the time when he's doing it, he's thinking, I shouldn't be doing this. And usually, what happens with this thought we are misunderstanding, we are misinterpreting this thought. Because when the person does a lowly thing, an inappropriate thing, there are two things that occur. One thing is that he loses self-respect. How could I do such a thing? He feels he's going low. He becomes coarse, he becomes lowly. Then there is another thing which is much, much more significant. That he senses and he feels that he is breaking away from Hashem, from the truth. He is involved at this moment in satisfying himself, and he is not thinking in the bigger picture. He's not thinking the reality. Like the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, that the only way it is possible for a person to do a sin is if at this moment he thinks that by doing this, his connection to Hashem will not be affected. This is called the Ruach Shtus. At this moment he loses, so to speak, clear thinking, and he convinces himself that this will not affect his standing, his connection to Hashem. Which means that in fact, this connection to Hashem is actually something that he senses even at the time when he's doing his sin. Except that we tend to misunderstand this, and we tend to view it and to interpret these thoughts, what we call guilt feelings, as personal guilt feelings. In other words, he feels guilty for himself that he is descending, he became so low. We don't realize that there is a truth behind it. In today's world, and this is important for us to understand because today's world creeps into each one of us. We are no longer isolated. In today's world, the prevailing, the common view from the psychologists and from the therapists and all that, the common view is that if a person feels guilty for doing something wrong, they tell him, don't feel guilty. It's okay. And you know something? You know why you feel guilty? Because you were so conditioned. It's important to understand. You were so conditioned. You were taught to feel guilty. This is not a true thing. As a child, you were taught that to do wrong is wrong and to do right is right. But really, it's insignificant. As long as you don't hurt another person, as long as the policeman will not catch you, you're okay. This is a horrific, really a horrible statement. This is a horrible statement. This is saying, this is completely denying the soul, denying the reality of the person. Where, right and wrong, good and bad is all by choice. And it's all what's called conventional. Conventional, what conventional means? Something that was agreed upon by convention, by human agreement. We agree to live like this. Just like we eat with a spoon, the Chinese eat with sticks, with chopsticks. There's no requirement to eat with a spoon or with chopsticks. It's convention. It's the same thing. It's a convention to live a decent life or this kind of life. We have to understand that the principles of right and wrong, the principles of good and bad, they emanate. Emanate? They come from. Our sense of it comes from our very souls. Our sense of being alive, our sense of living in reality, of believing that our life is significant. We're not just living for our experience, but it's a significant thing to live, and it's meaningful, and it's purposeful. That is inherent in our soul. That's inherent in us. This is not something which is conventional. This is not something that's being drilled into us. This is a reality that emanates from the soul itself. I once asked somebody, I don't know if I discussed this over here. I vaguely remember, I don't remember here or over there. I asked a simple question. People say that every human being is concerned with his own welfare, concerned with himself, his own security, his own food, his own comfort. So I ask you a very simple question. Seems simple, but it's very, very deep. What would happen if you took a capsule, a space capsule, and you equipped the space capsule with all human needs for 1,000 years? Food, and water, and air, and every kind of entertainment, every kind of sports, machines, everything that the person enjoys doing on his own. And you put a human being in this capsule, and he is secure. Nobody's going to ever attack him. Sent it out into air, into space. And this person has everything that he will ever need physically. What do you think the experience of this person would be?
Go insane.
Excuse me?
He'll go insane.
Yeah, after
It'd be horrible.
He'd kill himself.
What?
Without human contact, he would
He would what?
go crazy. He'd kill himself
Why?
because he needs interaction.
Let us say that he has interaction through email, or through Skype, or through telephone.
No,
Not the
it's
same.
not the same. It's not the
He
same
needs human
thing.
contact.
He needs It's not like that way.
You're talking about that.
Be bored.
You're concerned.
Everybody's saying the same thing.
Yeah.
You'd be bored. My dear friends, this is living death. This is not bored. This is not boredom. This is not missing something. This is missing life itself. Because life consists of purpose. You have to be in participation. You don't live by yourself. You live in the big world, in God's world. You're totally ineffective. You're not living in a living environment. You're living in a dead environment. His experience will not be any of this, that he's bored or he doesn't have human contact. He does not have life itself. He's not really alive. Because this phenomenon of being alive, is a real phenomenon in human beings. This is not conventional. This is not something like a boredom where you're bored, you need to do something, you have to prove yourself, none of that. This is all experiential. One person feels bored sitting and learning. Another person feels, oh great, I can sit and learn 25 hours a day. I'm not bored. I don't need company. I can sit and learn myself. There were people who were able to sit and concentrate in thought for days, for 24 hours straight. But they were in reality, in real life. This phenomenon that a person has real life ticking in his mind and in his soul, this is true all the time. Whether he is doing a good thing, whether he's going on Mesiras Nefesh, or he is succumbing and giving in to his taiva and is doing the wrong thing. Which means that even while he was doing the Aveda, he did not really mean it. He was not fully into it. He was into it only on a certain level, on a superficial level. There was a very great part of him, and not only a great part, but the essence, his essential part of him wasn't even involved. This is just like when a person gets his hands dirty. Very dirty. He has ink all over his hands. But the ink, right, it sets in and becomes, you have to wash it once, twice, 3 times with soap, with hot water, this. But you can wash it off. Why? Because beyond the skin, it didn't reach. No sin reaches beyond the skin. In other words, he did this thing, it was wrong, but there was a certain part of him that wasn't involved in this, and as a matter of fact, he was conscious of this part, because he said, what am I doing? I shouldn't be doing this. And this little voice that said, I shouldn't be doing this, this is a real voice coming from his own soul. This is not because he will be embarrassed, because he'll be ashamed, because he's going to be scared, because of any consequence, but because he cannot relate to this action. His real self, cannot relate to this action. So that the blemish, the stain of this ink, the stain of this sin goes quite deeply, but it is washable. It is not a stain that permeated the whole soul. And this is in fact how it's possible to do tshuva. Because no matter what a person did, there's the healthy part in him that was not stained by this action, that was not affected by this action. And he can bring this out and connect to that soul of his, to that soul, and clean himself up. And this is what this phenomenon, in this story of the Bnei Korach tells us. And actually it's a din Shulchan Aruch, that a person can do tshuva in one instant. In one instant. How can you do tshuva? You have to correct everything you did. It's true, you have to correct everything you did. But there's everything that you did affects only a certain level. There's a certain part of you, of the person himself, that was not participant in this whole action. And this is how the Bnei Korach, just by thinking of tshuva, just thought, they didn't correct anything. They already were saved, their lives were spared. Even though they were swallowed up, they were swallowed up because on the surface they didn't do anything, and all the Eden saw that they did their Veda, and they had to be correctly. Moshe Rabbeinu said, all who did the Aveda will be swallowed up. They did the Aveda. And if they wouldn't be swallowed up, then Moshe Rabbeinu would be called a liar. So they had to be swallowed up. But nevertheless, that part of them, they were not fully involved, and that's how they set themselves. This is the part of the Pasha. Now we're talking about ourselves, which we already started and pointed out. It's important to understand and recognize that between the learning Chassidus, and you talk about the soul, talk about the neshama, this is not a theoretical thing. This is not some kind of, because we can't describe the neshama. We don't understand what the neshama is. That's why we don't understand God. So the neshama is godly, so we don't understand what it is. There's no way we can describe what it is. And be that as it may, we'll never be able to describe it. But this is really the essence of every one of us. This is what makes us understand and see and experience life. It's not our hands and feet and our mouth and our taste buds and our smell, none of that. Not even our eyes. That's what it says in Chassidus. That when a person sees, so we see that he sees with his eyes, he hears with his ears, he tastes with his taste buds, he feels with his hands. Now that's only the keli. This is only the external vessel. The real koyach, the real idea of sight, is that in the neshama there is a koyach that's called re'iyah, sight. And this koyach re'iyah functions through the eyes to see the physical article. But the experience of sight is a neshama experience. It's not a physical, it's not the eyes. The eyes don't see. Eyes don't see. It's the neshama that sees. The eyes allow the neshama to connect to the physical world, to see a physical article. Otherwise, the neshama would see only spiritual things. The same thing is touch, the same thing everything else. So this neshama phenomenon is very real. We have to understand that this is very real, and that the koyach that allows us to grow, to correct our past, and to come out of it completely, wash away every stain, and to come out of it completely. And then beyond that, by learning, we can grow higher and higher and higher. The reason this happens is not because of the activity of the learning itself, but it is because as you're learning, more of this neshama surfaces. Every time that you understand something, there's a certain spark of the neshama that surfaces. I know it, I understand. We all experience the following. Sometimes you learn something, and you have a difficulty in understanding it. And you dig again, and somebody explains it to you a second time, and a third, and a 10th time, until finally it says, oh, I got it. What means you got it? What did you get? What does it mean, I got it? I got it means that this idea that you're explaining to me, I really had it all the time, but I couldn't connect it to. And now I connect it. I see that I always knew this. I never thought of it. But this is something which I always knew. Because in our soul we understand, we know everything. And everything that we learn externally is that because, just like we cannot see the physical article without our eyes, even the neshama has the koyach hariyah, the same thing, we cannot understand things in our physical world without learning and revealing and bringing out that koyach nefesh. But this is very real. It is extremely important for us to recognize so that we do not allow ourselves to fall, not ourselves to be discouraged when we make a mistake, when we don't understand, and at the same time, on the contrary, to recognize that there is really no limit how far we can go, how much we can reach, and what the effect of learning and davening can possibly be. The neshama is a godly presence in every person. Like the Alter Rebbe says, "Chelek elokam ma'al mamash," which means that from the perspective of this neshama, we are capable, we know the truth at the godly level. We don't need the world to tell us about God. We know God directly, but we're not aware of it. And we become aware of it by learning and explaining that the world was created by God. But in reality, we know it all the time. And this is what allows, this is what enables us to be able to face all kinds of difficulties, even to the extent of Mesiras Nefesh. The union of Pinchass primarily stands for the Mesiras Nefesh. Pinchass, he stood up, you know the story, I'm sure you learned, that when he stood up, about in the middle of the whole episode, Moshe Rabbeinu didn't know what to do. Aaron didn't know what to do. Pinchass got up and he went after Zimri, and he killed him, and he risked his own life, because the whole Sheva, the whole tribe of Shimon were around there, and this Indian of Kanos, of to stand up for Hashem, with Mesiras Nefesh, what capability does a person have to do that? How can a person have this koyach? This is a koyach that comes straight from the nefesh, from the neshama. I once explained the phenomenon of a soldier. A soldier at what? Anybody here was ever a soldier? Nobody?
Yeah.
You were a soldier? You were in the front? Were you in the front? You were in the front? You tell me if I'm wrong. I was never a soldier, but I understand how it works. The soldier stands there in the front lines, and he's facing the enemy, and the enemy is shooting at him. Shooting at him. And he has to have, by rule, by training, the presence of mind to stand there, not to run away, to protect himself as best as he can, as he was trained to protect himself, but basically to face the enemy and take his rifle and aim and shoot him down, take him down. Does anybody understand what type of concentration is necessary to be able to aim a rifle? You can't just aim a rifle. You have to aim it. You have to look through this viewer, and it should be perfect. Otherwise, you're just shooting in the air. It's nothing. You're wasting your bullets, and you're going to get hit. Chas v'sholom. You have to have presence of mind. You have to have tremendous character, to be able to stand there while you're being shot and calmly, so to speak, aim at this target. How is he able to do that? So I once asked this question, and somebody said, and everybody said, oh, well, if he doesn't do it, he's going to get killed. So he has to do it for self-protection. But if you think about it, if he thinks at this moment that I have to shoot back in order to self-protect, for sure he's going to get killed. If he is concerned about his own safety, he's finished. He's finished. The only way that he can do that is that he, at this point, at this moment, does not represent himself at all. He represents his country. He represents the purpose for which he's fighting. He is bigger than himself. He is part of this whole army. In olden days, we were saying he represents the king. He represents a much bigger phenomenon than himself. And this is what gives him the ability to stand there and completely forget about himself and do the job and do what he has to do. This is called Mesiras Nefesh. And the power of Mesiras Nefesh consists in this phenomenon, in being connected and aware of this greater truth that you are part of, that you represent. This greater truth is something which we, each one of us, represent. And we, each one of us, has the koyach to stand there and face the enemy and shoot him. Because we are not representing ourselves, we are representing the godly presence in our souls. And that cannot be stained, that cannot be drained and dragged down into tuma, into impurity. So at all times, like it explains in Tanya, but I just want to have it more practical. At all times, when a person feels challenged by any situation, by any enticement, something that draws him in the wrong direction, he has the ability, like that soldier, like the Alter Rebbe explains, he has the ability to remind himself and recognize that he actually has a godly soul, and he actually is connected and represents a godly presence. And he cannot possibly drag that into this too. Because that always remains outside of this type or whatever it is. This is what we see from this one simple episode. Rashi says they didn't do tshuva, they thought of tshuva. They thought of doing tshuva. So how did it work? Because they essentially were never involved in this. The neshama was never involved in this. This was all a mistake. This is what happens where a person is in a situation when he's drawn to whatever world is drawing him to. And it seems to me, it's impossible. This is the real thing. This is not the real thing. The real thing is when he has deep down in his neshama. That's the real thing. This is all a facade. And he is able to overcome it by reminding himself of the real thing, where he really is connected, who he really is. Therefore, the Rebbe should help each one of us to stay above, not to be drained in, to be swallowed up by the earth. We should stay on top of the earth and be able to stand up to all challenges. And always remind ourselves and recognize that this little voice in the back of our mind, back of our head that says, you don't belong there, this is a real voice. This is not just a voice that speaks about out of convention and out of guilt feeling. This is the real thing. This is the real thing. This is the real life. And we ought to respect that and connect to that. And this will carry us through all our challenges and bring success in our effort here in the yeshiva, bring success in our effort outside of the yeshiva, and we should all be zeicha to read Mashiach.
Amen.